All right, hello everybody. Welcome to UK CORRAL, the podcast that reviews all of the early comic book stories by our favorite UK writers. This is your co-host Mike L, and I'm joined by
Adamantium.
That's right, Adamantium. And unfortunately, Nice Man could not be with us tonight. Right, he's a busy guy, so.
He's not just nice man, he's busy man. But I will say it's very great that the most authentic UK comic show will have no one authentically from the UK on this podcast.
Yeah, we're just fans. Right?
Big
yeah,
fans,
we're not.
Yeah.
You know, it's funny. Speaking of, different nationalities. There was one time that we did a segment, and someone was accusing us of not being able to pronounce comic book properly. And then I looked at their profile, and they were from Texas. So I don't know how you pronounce comic book if you were from Texas.
Comic book?
No, I'm not even sure how. I don't want to attempt to do a southern accent, but anyway. Okay, so today we're going to have a lot of fun because we are going to talk about some of Neil Gaiman's earliest work at DC Comics. Now, he kind of, what's that expression the horse analogy, when you burst out of the gate running or something?
Oh, you can lead a horse to water, but you can't make him run out of a gate?
No, the other one. Doesn't matter. Okay, but he pretty much was huge from the moment he started. He did a couple graphic novels, got hired by DC, and at this point, whatever you think of Neil Gaiman, at this point his writing was... I think these early stories are excellent, which we can talk more about as we review them, but these are godsend. Like, these are so good. But anyway...
Yeah, and, Mike, just preamble here. Let's not ignore the elephant in the room. Some stuff has come out.
Yes.
It's not very favorable for Mr. Gaiman.
No.
But with that said, I think we are going to do a bit of a separation from the creator, from the created content as best as we can, because that is the beautiful thing about having these big, squishy things inside of our heads. We can do these complex separations where we can appreciate the created content without necessarily endorsing the creator. This is not a show to give opinions on the creator himself, just on these works, which were admittedly released quite a few years ago. I think it was
89
these were released. So I have a question for you, because my chronology is a little bit messed up. Is this pre or post Sandman?
This is pre Sandman. So
okay.
Yeah, I believe Sandman, I think that it started in the summer of 89. So he comes in just at the end of the 80s, but this is right before that. So he was not a superstar yet. Again, Secret Origins was just the concept of Secret Origins is great. Just retelling DC's superhero origins in the post-crisis kind of continuity. Unfortunately, Roy Thomas wrote almost all of them, and I'm not a huge fan of his writing. And whatever he added to these origins did not help them, in my opinion. I don't know if you've read many of these, have you?
I've always kind of eked away from them, because my mentality is I love when origins are ambiguous. Sure. People reference the Joker quite a bit for this, but there's plenty of other comic book characters where I like the fact there's not a defined origin from them. And I think we could maybe even make that argument for some of the origins we're going to see, where there's enough ambiguous elements to really question, is this authentic or not? Which I appreciate. I don't need to know the nitty-gritty details of someone's background. I think oftentimes the character's actions for what they're doing in the present is more fascinating than whatever origin story they have. And we get so muddled down in the sort of lore and origin storytelling that I think we see that problem affect a lot of adaptations, especially in film, where it's so focused on that, it's missing the point of, well, it's an interesting character that we can develop and tell a great story with, but we would just want to keep talking about how Peter Parker's parents were killed and he was bitten by a spider. Let's get beyond that.
Sure.
That's my take, which is why I've kind of steered clear of this. I will say I have read one of these issues before, and it was the annual, which we'll be tackling a little bit later.
Okay, so I actually do like origins, to be honest. I love origin stories. I usually find them the most interesting thing about a superhero, to be honest.
Fascinating.
So I have no problem with these. But I will say that the way that these are done, if you're going to do an origin story in the way that to address what you've talked about, I think this is the way to do it. to leave it kind of ambiguous, which we'll talk about. So how about this? Do you mind if I summarize the Poison Ivy story?
Absolutely. And I did figure out how to pronounce the title because I was really mulling over on the title page here. What is it? So the title is Pavane. And do you know what that is?
No, I don't. What is it?
So that's actually a little bit of an evocation of two things. One is a type of dance that was common in Europe in the 16th century that was a bit of a processional dance, one that would happen for like a great sort of, I guess you could say, arrangement or orchestration of movement, very choreographed. And the other one is a type of work that was composed by Gabriel Fauré, a French composer back in the 1880s. So two possible origins for what the name of this issue could actually mean.
Interesting, very interesting. Again, it helps to have stories written by people that are very well read, right? Like I think that's what augments this. His work, Alan Moore's work, Grant Morrison's work. But anyway, we'll talk more about that later. So this origin story starts out in media res. Is that how you pronounce it?
Yes.
Basically, the hero, we'll call the protagonist of the story, is narrating himself watching Poison Ivy on a security monitor, and we basically find out through the story. Do they say, is he at Arkham Asylum? I don't remember.
I don't believe he's in Arkham. I believe this is another facility for criminally insane individuals, and I think the end's going to reveal why that is.
Okay,
but
gotcha.
I'll let you continue, yes.
So he's narrating. It's almost hard to, like, I want to talk about the plot, but I also want to talk about how the story is told because it's so well done. But he's talking about what he's describing Poison Ivy as he's watching her on the security monitor, and basically he's kind of hinting at why he's there and what he's doing. And he's a psychologist, and he's going to be interviewing Poison Ivy. He talks about the rules that they give him. He's in the first page here. He meets a character, a security guard. He's led into the room and he meets her, and we get a very interesting, a kind of femme fatale-ish introduction to Poison Ivy, where it's very clear from the beginning that she's intelligent, manipulative, right? Right away, we start to learn about her origin. Now, I'm not overly familiar with her origin of the comics, but as far as I know, this might be the first time that she's called, because she has two names, right? She gives Pamela Isley, but then she has another name, right?
Yeah, and actually I can shed some light on this. So
sure, go ahead.
During like the formation of DC Comics, like the editorial team was dealing with so much continuity, there would be continuity errors, and that would mean characters would have different origins or different names. And so that's what this is an allusion to.
Gotcha.
He's asking what her real name is. It's either Belle Rev, or sorry, not Belle Rev. That's another reference.
Yeah.
But Pamela Isley, there was another one, Lillian. Basically, she said, no, it's all a mistake. My actual name is Lillian Isley. It's Pamela Lillian Isley, which I will say, the only authentic thing Batman and Robin got right in that film was the character's name.
Yes.
Adaptation.
Okay.
And obviously, Mr. Freeze's deep Austrian accent.
Mm-hmm. Yes, of course. Yes. And I love the fact that like you said, they figured a way to address these inconsistencies by having her just say, "Oh, they can't. The files on me can't even agree on my name." And then at one point she says, "Oh, I make stuff up all the time. I'm surprised that people believe it, or whatever." So that's a way of them explaining contradictory origins from DC Comics, which I love, right?
Mm-hmm.
So he's asking to find out kind of her backstory, and so. At first, she's like, she gives him a little bit. She gives him her name, but then he leaves, and she blows him a kiss. Then she goes outside, or he goes outside, and then as he's walking out, the security guard that had let him in gives him her name, and she's like, "My name's Paula. I get up at 9. You're cute when you're embarrassed." So there's a little bit of flirtation going on there, and then that's intercut with him watching her on the monitor again, right? So it's a little bit vague about the chronology of things and stuff like that. But we cut over to him narrating himself on this date, and we can see that the girl Paula is getting annoyed with him because all he keeps talking about is poison ivy, and he's asking questions about poison ivy, and this girl's getting pissed off about that. But then and she's trying, the security guard's trying to kind of warn him, like, to stay away from her, she's dangerous, blah blah blah, but he just can't get her out of his head. And so we cut back to him watching her on the monitor, and then now we're in the scene, now he's sitting with her, and now poison ivy is going to tell him her backstory. And so she talks about how she was raised as an only child by her mother and her rich mother and father. She always wanted to be a botanist. Let's see here. And let's see. Oh yeah, she's like, I used to talk to my plants, tell them my dreams. And then as she's talking, as she's explaining this, we're still having him asking questions back and forth. So it's kind of going back and forth between the two of them. Then he introduces the idea that she actually studied under Jason Woodrue, who's the Floronic Man, who we all know because we love DC Comics, right?
Well, and actually this corrected the continuity because there were, again, conflicting origins for Pamela Isley at this point. And so he even alludes to, looking at his file, it says, apparently you were under a Frenchman named Legrand who asked you to steal a special herb, but that was actually a poison. And she corrects him saying, no, I actually studied under Jason Woodrue. So that is very fascinating because already we can see Neil Gaiman is really focusing on just synthesizing these origins and going, nope, that's something misattributed to me. This is the reality. Again, with that caveat earlier on, her saying, I say so much stuff, I can't believe anyone believes me. So there's still that seed of doubt. Well before The Dark Knight with the Joker going, all these different origins and, these inconsistencies with his explanations of where he came from, kind of is set OG with Poison Ivy in this issue. I got to point out, though, Alan Moore did it in Killing Joke, too. Remember? Then never mind my point. That's right. Chronologically speaking, you're correct.
Yeah, 87, the Joker did say, sometimes I remember it one way, sometimes I remembered another. And so I always assumed that's where Christopher Nolan got it from.
What? I think you're right. It's interesting, too, you brought that up, because I think, and this is not a discredit to the earlier writing of Gaiman, because I do think there was a lot of powerful stuff. He took a lot from Alan Moore, to say the least. He even took over writing Miracle Man from Alan Moore. So I think there are some more isms in here. This element might be part of it. But with that said, no, I like the synthesis of these different conflicting origins, just setting a straight path here for Poison Ivy.
Right. So again, there's so many things I want to talk about, but she then starts to talk about him. She's like, I had some pictures of him up on my wall, and I wanted to meet him. I knew how he'd feel about me if we ever met. And we see these pictures of her wearing a Batman shirt, and on the wall we see an Amazing Heroes magazine cover and a Batman poster and a Batman logo. And then the hero of the story says, you're talking about Batman here? What a cool way to introduce her enthrallment with Batman's career. I just love it. I love it.
And there's a vintage thing happening too with the art, because it goes from this very modern style that you see in 89 to, I don't know if they're actual reproductions of panels from 1960s and 70s issues, but it's mimicking that art at the very least.
Yeah, I think it is recreation, and it's awesome. I love this. And again, I read this when I was 13, and I wasn't overly familiar with Batman's history, but I knew, I was like, oh, okay, I see what they're doing. They're integrating the old 60s stories. I just thought it was brilliant. This is great. And so we see some kind of old dynamic duo covers recreated and images recreated. So, and then again, she's talking about how she's good at crime and this, that, and the other. And then we cut, and in the middle of this, we cut over to him, the hero, on another date with this security guard. Then in the middle of, like, she's talking, he's narrating. We're now cutting over to he's in bed with this girl, Paula. And as he's narrating, he's like, during the night, I dream and I call it a name and I wake up and I'm saying Ivy, Ivy. And Paula's awake next to me and she doesn't say anything, but I can tell she's awake from her breathing. They teach us stuff like that in the agency. I love this stuff. So
this is also part of the reveal too, because he's not the psychologist he's saying. By this point in the narrative, it's revealed he's actually an agent for Task Force X, aka Suicide Squad, and he's evaluating whether or not Ivy can become a member. Also, it's revealed he's married with children. He's not Al Bundy, but
yes, is that right here where that's revealed?
It's just prior to the scene where they're in bed together. So it's establishing he isn't just thirsty for Poison Ivy. He's he's a little promiscuous one. He's a little naughty boy.
And it's done so well because the way that Neil Gaiman withholds that information until this point. So you just kind of think this guy's a slime ball, eh? Like he's obsessed with Poison Ivy. He's in bed with this girl Paula, and he's got a wife and kid at home. Like he's pretty slimy, like I said. So anyway, then we cut back over to him interviewing Poison Ivy, and now they're outside and they're talking, and he's like, "Oh, well, why did you pick the name Poison Ivy? He's like, why not a flower? Why a weed? There's no such thing as a weed, Stuart. A weed is just a plant some human decides is growing in the wrong place." So they're kind of going back and forth, and she basically kind of has this dramatic moment where we see like the plants and the trees all around her, and she's kind of just trying to explain what she is. She's like, "I'm a genius. I am the queen of May, crowned in leaves and blossoms and thorns. I am hope and beauty and truth." And then at that moment, she grabs him. And oh wait, no, it's not that moment. Where is it?
Oh, it is there.
It is there. Yeah, that's right. He grabs her hand, and she is immune to poison, but she's able to burn his hand because she can kind of secrete poison, right?
That's the idea. So there's a body horror element suddenly thrown in here, not only with her being able to manipulate these plants around her, which I don't think was clearly established yet within the comic lore. I think this might be new to this issue, but dealing with poisons was definitely pre-established, and this is huge. Like she has this acidic grip that she can exude, and it continues because not only does she grab his hand, she then plants a big old kiss on his cheek.
Yes. And then she's like, and all we find out is that she's just trying to convince him. He's like, "Get me out of here, get me out of her." So then she's taken away by the guards. He ends up looking in the mirror, and her kiss, like lipstick, is burned onto his cheek. And he's like, "I hope it will fade. I don't know how I'll explain it to my wife." So then we cut back over to him watching her on the screen. And she's like kind of pleading to him on the camera, "Stuart, you won't forget, will you? I have to get out of here. It's driving me crazy in here. I have to get out." And he's looking at the camera and he's narrating. And it's kind of tying back to the very first scene in the book. And he's narrating through, and he's like, I'm sorry, pretty Ivy, Poison Ivy, crazy Ivy. You can turn the sound, but you can't turn off the picture." Whew. And the story is perfectly bookended because it opens up with him watching her on the monitor. I can see her on the monitor stroking a lily of the valley, and on and on and on. So it really is, in my opinion, a nearly perfect story. So there you have it. The Neil Gaiman origin of Poison Ivy. It's only how many pages long?
14, I believe.
Yeah. And I think this is brilliant. What do you think, Adam?
It's good. There's a lot of subtlety happening here. I think even with the plot progressing, you're never really clear if he just has this fixation over her, apropos of nothing, or if she's secreting some sort of pheromone, somehow manipulating him into being allured by her. Even the guard, Paula, at some point says a lot of men are driven crazy by her, giving that implication. Because in the comics, previous lore, it is established she can use chemicals and pheromones to manipulate men to her whims. But, regardless of that, there is this interesting shift that happens at the end where we clearly see, the audience knows, he's being manipulated. It's very clear that Poison Ivy is trying to use him to her means while he thinks he's trying to evaluate her for Task Force X. But then there's yet another twist at the end where he abandons her. He is going to be haunted by the memory. He's literally scarred by her. And yet at the same time, he turns off the sound and leaves the building. He's not admitting her to Task Force X or releasing her. It even says on a disposition that he left on the table that it's recommended she goes to Arkham Asylum.
Right,
so
right.
There's a lot of odd subtlety happening in the story where I think maybe the best way to describe it is that Neil Gaiman is really good at dealing with tension. There's a lot of tension and then release. And just when we think we know where the story is going or what the resolution will be, there's suddenly a pivot, which is just genius. This is also, again, I think underscoring what makes the recent information about Neil Gaiman coming out so hard. Because at this point, very few people wrote female characters in comics as strongly as he did. I should say, at least in terms of male writers. So, that's especially heartbreaking with that news coming out. But with this, you had this powerful story of Poison Ivy, which again, as I said before, there's ambiguity. How much of this is true? And as comics went on, they would corroborate this origin and they would really officiate it. But I like this sort of ambiguity of, is she telling the full truth? Is that actually her name? Is that actually her family background? All we really know is she has this ability to manipulate plants and secrete poison, and that's it. And that's genius. There's something mythological. There's something almost like ancient about her, especially in that sequence where all the tendrils of the plants are just kind of roiling behind her. It's gorgeous and scary, and it makes her such an intriguing character in a way where other writers really failed to up until this point.
Well, I think you've hit the nail on the head here when you mentioned like making her kind of mythical. And I think my favorite thing about this is, if I can go back, there was a point in the 70s when Steve Englehart started writing Justice League, okay? And he likes to pat himself on the back for being the first writer to have the characters refer to each other by their first names. Instead of Wonder Woman and Superman and Batman, it was Diana and Clark and Bruce. And I actually, as I grew older, I grew to like that less and less because they're always trying so hard to make them ordinary people, and they lose some of their stature as mythological level characters. And I think if you're going to do when people think of an adult way to write a superhero, they think, well, it's got to have graphic sex and violence. But actually, no, this is how you do an adult take on a superhero. You have a normal person interacting with a supervillain, and the supervillain is almost godlike. Not only in their power, but in the mystery. They're not an ordinary person, and we don't, even what we do learn about them, we don't know if it's true or not, right? He's manipulated by her. She's treated like you said, like a mythological godlike character, and I think it's like this keeps her on that pedestal of a mythological stature, but we also do get a good story out of it with his relationship with Paula and finding about his wife and kid and what his mission is. Like, Neil Gaiman's able to tell a multi-level story with twists and turns, but you don't lose, like Poison Ivy doesn't lose anything from that. She still has her great stature at the end of it, and that's what I love about this.
And I think this is kind of a weird fail-safe for the story as well, because even if there's an element you don't care about it or you don't really agree with, then you can just kind of chalk that off to, oh, well, we don't know if this is really what's happening or if this is just part of this mythology she's building for herself. I will admit the only thing I didn't really care for was her basically being a Batman fanboy or fangirl in this comic. Like, I felt that was a little bit far-reaching, but nothing to the point where I felt like it was offensive or that it made the story cringeworthy. It was fine, and the art was really fantastic. Now, sometimes I think the inks were a bit heavier than they needed to be in here, but there was a lot of great shadow work that set moods, especially as you mentioned, the opening panels where we see Ivy. She's cast in shadow. She appears to be pensive, and then suddenly she looks up and she has this beaming smile that she's casting at the interrogator, which I think just shows, oh, she knows she's playing this game. You talked about her being like a femme fatale, which is usually how Poison Ivy is presented in a lot of media. But especially in here with the heavy use of inking for shadows, it's very prominent. And I forget who the artist was. I think it was Mark
Is it
Oh,
Mark
what was
Beacom?
his- Yes, yes, that's who it is.
Okay.
Oh no, sorry, Mark Bright. I
No,
have to.
no, no. Mark Bright's on the Green Lantern one.
Oh, then is it Beacom? I'm not quite sure.
Okay, I'm gonna here. I was gonna look this up really quick. Neil Gaiman. Let's see here. It is Mark Buckingham, who also did Miracle Man with Neil Gaiman.
Oh,
Right?
that explains why I like the art so much.
Yeah. Yeah. I'm not a huge fan of Mark Buckingham, but when he's good, and he's smart. Like the way that the effort that he puts into Poison Ivy's body language and some of the line work, like the close up here on this eye, you can't see it, but the viewers can. It's really well done. I think if I had to, and also when the shot of her blowing a kiss, that's really well done. I think the only detail of the story that I didn't care for was the revelation that he's kind of just recruiting for Suicide Squad. I personally, we had a big debate about this on an episode of our newest podcast, Last Call. Check it out soon, where we basically talked about how continuity is not all it's cracked up to be. And one of the things is that, in a way, the fact that this has to tie into Suicide Squad, it kind of deflates the, not tension, but it kind of ruins the tone a little bit. However, like you said, because the lead character goes on to the next thing, and we probably never see her in Suicide Squad, you can kind of ignore that. Like, this story can exist almost on its own, right?
It's an interesting aspect to consider too, because obviously with Suicide Squad or Task Force X, you see all the successful incumbents. You never really see all like the failed interviews or the failed, I guess you could say, evaluations. And this is kind of interesting, and it gets your mind going. Like, who else was screened and failed to pass, and why? I think that would be kind of an interesting series in and of itself, just to explore that. And I don't know if there was any other Secret Origins issues that maybe delved into that sort of story conceit. I didn't mind it so much, though, just because, again, it didn't really go as an origin for her joining the Suicide Squad. It was just a means for this character to enter into this relationship with Poison Ivy. And to be frank, I can't think of any other way to really have him engage with her and then betray her at the end by just rejecting her and running away. So I didn't mind that aspect as much.
Okay.
But yeah, so much to love. I do appreciate the art, and again, the vintage art that they throw in here, it's top shelf stuff. It's great.
Mm-hmm. And also only 13 pages. Mm-hmm. And these 13 pages that I read as a kid, when I was 13, have stuck with me for 35 years. Like, this stood out above all the other. There was a bat glut that year, 1989. There was so much content, and this is definitely one of the stories that stood out among all the other ones that I read. So it's definitely a good issue. So yeah, that same year there was a Secret Origins special that featured the secret origin of 3 other Bat villains. Now this one also this has a framing sequence by Neil Gaiman, and it has a Riddler origin by Neil Gaiman. And we're only going to talk about the Neil Gaiman stuff. We can quickly allude. Did you read the Penguin and Two-Face stories?
I did.
Okay, because I read Two-Face. No, wait, sorry. I read Penguin, but not Two-Face. But we can just briefly mention them if you want as we're going. How about that? Okay. So now, so do you want to jump in with the summary of this one?
Yeah. Now, because we're doing multiple parts here for this, do you want maybe to trade off with the prologue, story, epilogue? How do you feel?
It's totally up to you.
Okay.
I don't know. Like, whatever. Yeah. Do you want me to do the intro then?
Yeah. You know what? If you do the prologue, I'll do the rest. And
okay.
Just before you do, Mike, I want your take on the cover. What do you think of it?
Well, I love Brian Bolland. I mean, I have nothing bad to say about this cover. I think it's great. What do you think?
It is one of those covers that it's should be iconic. I don't know why it isn't. I just look at it and I feel like this should be a thing that is on posters and available in backgrounds for people's computers. Like it just is like a great snapshot of three of Batman's greatest rogues. I love it. Like you said, Bowen's work is just incredible. And I just had to say, I think he might actually be my favorite artist to work on Two-Face.
He's definitely up there. Like he is one of the best artists. He unfortunately did so little interior work, right? Like it was mostly covers. Although he did do, what was it? Camelot 3000.
Yes.
Which I used to own. I used to own the original issues and I sold them. But anyway.
Quickly, what's your take on Two-Face? Do you prefer the symmetrical down the middle Two-Face, or do you prefer the kind of blotchy, mushy Two-Face?
I don't know. I'm loving this image here. I'm loving it. Yeah. Like around this time, he was green and they kind of made him purple. I don't know. I love this. This is perfect. The other reason this image might not be as iconic as it should be is because it doesn't have Joker. They got to figure out a way to incorporate Joker into this image. Then I'm sure it'd be on T-shirts everywhere, you know?
Oh, he's just behind Penguin. That's all. You just can't see him.
Yeah, there you go. Okay, so you want me to do the intro then?
If you please.
Okay, so we have this artwork is by Mike Hoffman, and the inks are by Kevin Nolan. I love Kevin Nolan. Anyway, so Batman is sneaking into someone's house. The person whose apartment he's sneaking into is a guy named Mr. Jones. He's basically trying to scare this guy because he doesn't approve of this person's project, which we find out later is that he's working on kind of a documentary, and they're interviewing various Batman villains, which we find out later is Riddler, Penguin, and Two-Face. And I love, there's a little sequence here where he's trying to scare the guy, and he's like, no, it's not dangerous for me, it's dangerous for you. And the guy says, you don't scare me. And Batman says, don't I? Now that's a real pity. And then he just swings away. So cool. Batman's they always find new ways to make Batman cool, don't they? So then we cut over to him talking to the rest of the film crew. There's four of them all together, and they're kind of just going back and forth about what happened and what they're going to be doing and blah blah blah. And so one of the running subplots of this is that they keep bringing up the Joker and how they cannot find the Joker because at this point in Batman's history, after death in the family, the Joker was either dead or missing. Like no one knew where he was. So they mention Two-Face, they mention Scarecrow, how Scarecrow wants to talk to them. And it's funny because then she makes a little reference here. She's like, talks about how Scarecrow wants to talk about his own lecture, and then she starts reading from it, and then he's like, someone else in the crew's like, forget him, you know. So let's move on to the next one. So then he's like, okay, well, let's talk about Riddler. What about Riddler? Maybe we can interview him. Then they bring up the Joker again, and then, okay, I just want to make sure I'm not skipping anything here. Okay, so this goes on for another two more pages. So then they're talking, they're kind of just going back and forth. They mention the Penguin. Then we see them sitting down in the studio. They have a Penguin with them, and then it cuts into the Penguin's origin, which was not by Neil Gaiman. So we're not really going to analyze it, but you did say you read it.
I did, and I'll give a very brief synopsis of it. So basically what happens is his thug, Knuckles, who worked with Penguin before, found out about his boss's origin story. And through this interview, he reveals it. And it's unique because I don't think Penguin ever had much of an origin aside from being like upper class, just kind of a funny looking man. But here they actually show he was the victim of a lot of bullying in his life. And that kind of led to his downfall into criminal insanity. And the main thrust of the story is him getting revenge on someone who bullied him throughout his youth. And we get these really incredible pieces of artwork throughout this, very oddly dark and discordant for what traditionally is a pretty irreverent character from Penguin. But yeah, it ends with Penguin not quite managing to get his full revenge, even though he does torture his attacker. Batman does save him in the end, and Penguin escapes. And then Therefore, the story ends, and that completes Knuckles' recounting of what happened with his boss. This story was actually by Alan Grant, and he's very divisive, I will say, but I am a big fan of Sam Keith's artwork, and he does the artwork for this, and I really did love it. Again, not a huge UK connection necessarily, but I would recommend Sam Keith, although actually there is a connection because he would do the covers for the majority of the Sandman run that Neil Gaiman would write.
And Alan Grant's also British, so.
Yeah. Well, then we should have talked about it.
We could have, but this is a Neil Gaiman episode, right? But I will say that story, it does hold up pretty well, and the art is excellent by Sam Keith. It's really good.
It is gorgeous. There's this weird thread going through it that I'm not such a fan of, where basically Penguin, growing up, being bullied, his only friends were his pet birds because his parents owned a bird store. I think it was just called Birds and Stuff. According to the window sign, it was just Birds and Stuff. What do you want? Birds and Stuff. Why not? And so then after he fights back his bully one time in his youth, the bully comes in and kills every single bird in this pet store, which first off, that's a lot of damn birds to kill. But second off, is pretty grotesque. It's a very dark story for a Penguin origin, which, again, he's usually such a light, like barring the Tim Burton Batman Returns version, such a kind of ephemeral sort of character who's just kind of jaunty and kind of ridiculous and silly. But this really made him have a quasi-tragic backstory in a way that I was not anticipating. But I did, as I said, I read this issue before many, many years ago because I heard about this origin and I had to check it out. I don't think it disappoints either.
I think it's really good. And I'm not always a fan of Sam Keith's art, but I think here it's just perfect. Maybe it's because it's about the Penguin, and maybe he's just so well suited to the Penguin. Like for the viewers out there, like you can see the incredible ink work he does on Penguin's face. And obviously some of the figures are a little bit distorted, but you just kind of this goes back to the whole idea. I'd rather see a good comic book artist than one of these kind of Photoshop artists that draws it and then manipulates it in a computer and all that. I can't stand that garbage. I'd rather look at this any day. Like this
100%. Yeah.
So,
I also love how every character looks a little gnarly, a little ugly. Like both Penguin and Batman have like 5 o'clock shadows, like there's stubble on their face. Like there is like some weird grittiness to this artwork, which I love, which honestly Keith is known for. But I really do love this.
Yeah, I agree. Okay, so then now we're gonna jump. So then we jump back to the TV studio, and so it's been a month since I read this. I don't remember. Are they learning these stories on the set? Do you remember?
They are. So okay, I'll just take it up from here.
Yeah, sure.
Basically, the TV crew who's assembling this documentary, they're still talking about potential people they can speak with. There's the ex of Two-Face. They're still clamoring to get the Joker. But what has happened is that after getting some correspondence from Edward Nygma, a.k.a. the Riddler, they confirm this indeed is the Riddler. It's presented as if they're not really familiar with who he is, that he's more obscure. And so they decide, okay, well, based on this confirmation, let's go find out who this guy is, what his deal is. And this is kind of the intriguing part. We get into the Riddler section where they visit him in an old junkyard where he is basically taking care of all these different contraptions and giant things that have just kind of clotted around Gotham City for years. So if you can think of like Silver Age contraptions villains would use to trap Batman, or even stuff from the old 60s live action TV show with gigantic Rube Goldberg machines and like giant novelty typewriters. This junkyard contains all of it. And it's explained a little bit what happens here, why the crew is not so familiar with Riddler, because it is implied here that the Riddler has retired, that he has given up the mantle of Riddler and the life of crime to oversee and look after these abandoned items. Now, it's interesting because the title is called "When Is a Door," which is a evocation of a riddle he gives. When is a door not a door? And this is penciled by someone whose name I'm not familiar with. BEM89. Are you familiar with that?
No. Should I look this up while we're?
Yeah, maybe while we're doing this, it'd be interesting to see who this artist actually is because it's the most unique art, I think, in the entire issue. There's a lot of exaggeration, almost grotesquerie in the art. And you get this hyper cartoonish look of the Riddler, Edward Nygma. Now, what's great as the TV crew is going through this junkyard, we hear Edward Nygma talking to them, but we don't actually see him yet. Not until this great shot that's revealed on one of the pages. Unfortunately, it's not numbered, but the newscaster, Mr. Jones, looks up and goes, "So, Riddler, when did you begin your career as a costume criminal?" And then we just have the slow reveal as Riddler in his top hat, or sorry, his bowler hat, his purple mask, the suit jacket goes, "When? When is a door? When is a door into the past? When is a door into uncertainty? When is a door not a door?" And then he just starts laughing maniacally. And we see this completely unhinged Riddler. And he is kind of caterwauling and just jumping around the junkyard in all these very extremely flamboyant poses across different contraptions. He's on a giant gun at first, then he's on a giant cob of corn, then he's on a giant typewriter. Like he just bounces around, just really spouting out nonsensical riddles that he even admits at one point don't really have an answer.
Mm-hmm.
When they ask him why he became the Riddler, he says, "Maybe I wanted to match wits with Batman for the glory, the fame, the bucks. Maybe that isn't it at all." And this kind of cat and mouse game continues between the Riddler and the TV crew. And it really is appropriate that it's a cat and mouse game because there is a scene where he's in a giant block of cheese with a toy mouse right in front of him. So it's really indicating that this might be part of what he's doing. Regardless, he starts waxing about the old days when things were innocent, when people weren't killed, that him and the cabal of Catwoman, Penguin, and Joker, they would have gangs and they would have different heists. And they would even include henchmen and thugs with very appropriate monikers and nicknames. He talks about, he shows photos actually and talks about his old henchmen named Mark, and Mark. Obviously a play on question mark. And then it shows him with his villainesses, Query and Probe, which is like a very saucy sort of name to give these.
Sure.
But anyway, he throws away the photos while sitting on top of a giant camera. And, you know, he just pontificates about the old crowd, those that are no longer here in this new criminal world. He thinks and references direct villains from both the 60s comics and TV show, talking about Egghead, King Tut, Bookworm, and goes, "Sigh, where did they all go?" And he does actually talk about how at that point, no one ever hurt anybody. Not really. Nobody died. You look around these days, it's all different. It's all changed. Did I miss something? The Joker's killing people, for God's sake. Was I away when they changed the rules? And he's going on this sort of existential crisis, trying to figure out what has changed. And so we're getting this interesting meta-narrative, not only about Riddler, but also the state of comics and this sort of, as you alluded to, darkening, this maturing of it, which has come at the cost of making these characters bloodthirsty murderers, which is actually maybe even an allusion to the previous story with Penguin, where he has murdered multiple people in that story. Anyway, he continues rambling and he tears off the bowler hat and also his jacket, revealing one of his other trademark outfits, the skin-tight leotard covered in question marks, as he continues just rambling, jumping from giant item to giant item, and talking to the news crew. Another interesting bit of dialogue he reveals is when he asks, "When is a city not a city?" And the answer being when it's Batman. And so he's really talking about how both Batman and Gotham are connected. They are really one and the same. And then he talks about a riddle his dad gave him. And this might actually be the origin of Riddler. His dad gave him a riddle because he loved riddles as a child. And the riddle was, "What's green, sits in the bathtub, and whistles?" Edward Nygma thought about this for a long time and confessed to his father he didn't know. And his father said, "A salami." But a salami isn't green. You can paint it green. A salami doesn't sit in the bathtub. You can put it in the bathtub, but a salami doesn't whistle. His father smiled and said, I just put that in there to make it difficult. And I think we see this sort of corruption of the idea of these riddles making sense, and it goes along with this nonsensical, very irreverent sort of story we're getting with Riddler, where we're seeing potentially a descent into madness or a manifestation of this madness, where all these riddles were almost his attempt to create order in an orderless world. And here we are with him cleaving to the vestiges of this old nostalgic past with all these old devices, thinking about these old villains and capers he would engage in, and that he's not meant for this world anymore. He thanks the news crew and they exit, wondering if they had a waste of an afternoon or whether this was a good news story. But regardless, they walk away and go on to the next story, which is going to involve Two-Face. But that is our pseudo origin for the Riddler.
Well, once again, I did love it. Not as much as the Poison Ivy story, but even as a kid, I appreciated the meta narrative for sure. Because at this point, when I was reading superhero comics, I was not really aware of Watchmen. I was barely aware of Dark Knight, but I certainly knew about their impact, and I could feel that things were different, things were darker, and getting more violent, more realistic. And so, I appreciated this kind of meta narrative, acknowledging the old Adam West Batman, and like you said, specifically mentioning villains that were only in the TV show: King Tut, Bookworm, Marcia, Queen of Diamonds, Egghead. Those were only characters in the TV show. So I thought that was really clever, and also incorporating the old 1950s giant typewriters and giant pinball machines and props. I love that, because just at a time when they were trying to kind of make everybody forget about that stuff, they found a way to bring it back, or he found a way to bring it back. I think that was brilliant.
I agree. I mean, I think we would see Grant Morrison do similar things later on, maybe even around the same time. But there was this push of people understanding that, no, we can pay homage and tribute to what came before in the comics. We don't have to disown it or divorce it from the stories we're telling.
Right.
And I think it's also very appropriate that this illustrated Joker, Riddler, is heavily based on Frank Gorshin from the 60s Batman TV show. And it even resembles kind of an older, wizened, balding Gorshin.
Agreed.
It's brilliant. It's fantastic. And I think it's such an interesting contrast to the Penguin story and what we're going to see coming up with Two-Face. Yeah, no, it's great. Did you find out who the artist was, by the way?
Yes. So if you can speak French better than me, his name is Bernie Morel. Here, let me copy and paste it into the chat with you, and maybe you can pronounce it better than me. I'm ashamed of my French.
Oh no, you had it right, Bernie Morel. No,
okay.
No, excellent. And yeah, it does actually remind me of a lot of European comic art too. There is something that isn't traditionally North American superhero about it. It's very kinetic. I don't know how I would feel about this in maybe a more traditional superhero story, but with this type of narrative and how frantic the Riddler's presentation is, I think it's appropriate. I like it. Yeah.
Well, yeah, and like when they first introduced the Riddler on that one page where we see all of the giant props, and then he's kind of looking down, and with each panel we get more and more of his face. That first revelation of his face, it reminds me of another artist, but I can't think of who. But it's certainly not a traditional American superhero type art, right? Like you said, it's more European. It's more underground, right? So yeah, I really like this. And we also have to point out that I believe at the time the editor of Secret Origins was Mark Waid. So he was doing a really good job of finding these, the right people to be doing these stories. And this is a perfect example of that, I think.
Absolutely. I don't want to take too much time with the intervening story, but I'm just going to give a quick synopsis.
Sure.
Because it is a Two-Face origin. So basically what the story follows is that someone Harvey Dent had put into incarceration and did not make any deal with, did not agree to give him any time out of prison early, has finally been released, and he's going to seek revenge on Harvey Dent. Little does he know, in the intervening years, Harvey Dent has had that accident where acid was poured onto his face. Well, I guess that's not an accident. That's just outright like intentional at that point. But yeah, he's descended into madness and become Two-Face. And as a cost of that, has abandoned his wife. Now, his wife is the person being interviewed by this TV crew, and she's telling the story of the time that this convict who was released then went to her and tried to get revenge on Harvey Dent by being at her house where he assumed Harvey Dent was still living because they were married at that time. He's waiting and waiting as Harvey Dent himself, now Two-Face, is looking on, kind of stalking his wife in the shadows, seeing that this person has his wife basically in capture. And so just when this person is about to execute his wife and then set the house that he lived in previous to being Two-Face on fire, Harvey Dent crashes through the window, beats up this guy. He's about to kill him, but his wife pleads with him to not do it. And there's a glimmer, an essence of Harvey Dent still within Two-Face because he relinquishes the motive to kill him. He lets go. He takes him and his wife out of the burning house because at this point the house was accidentally set on fire. And it's basically at this point she realizes Harvey might be in there somewhere, but I can't be with this figure, with this Two-Face. And the story ends in this very tragic note where he's just continuing to look at her through the window of his van, somewhat stalking her, through her realizing that he is observing her, but not really doing anything about it. There's this kind of agreed upon divide between the two, and that's how the origin ends. I think this is the first time we really had this sort of psychological origin for Harvey Dent, because I believe, at least in his golden age appearance, when he was scarred, the reason he became a criminal was because he was a gorgeous man. And then he grew insane because he was deformed. And that was basically why he turned to a life of crime.
Right.
Yeah, him being a DA and him having this sort of psychological baggage where there is this darker element within his psyche to begin with, that only came about, I think, maybe around the Neil Adams era in the 70s, but wasn't fully explored until this.
You know, but I have to point out around the same time this story came out, there was Batman Year 3, which was also drawn by Pat Broderick. It might have been a year later. There was also the Batman Annual by Andrew Helfer, drawn by Chris Sprouse. Do you remember that one?
I actually don't.
It was a really, really good origin story, and I believe that kind of introduced the version that we know the most. But again, because I haven't really read much before that, I don't know how many of the elements were new. But yeah, it was Andrew Helfer, Chris Sprouse, and it was from August 90s. So it was a year later. So it probably incorporated some of the things from this story and expanded on it. But it was a really good one.
And I know the darker element of Harvey Dent was there to begin with, because even a few years before this, we had Dark Knight Returns, and
right,
and that had that quasi. It wasn't an origin story, obviously, but it did explore Harvey Dent's psychology, that there was no curing him, and it really did show the psychological scarring that he had, and I'm pretty sure that's because that was embedded somewhere within that comic run. I just don't think, even in those 70s comics or 80s comics, it went as deep as this one did. We really do get a more fleshed out sense of who Harvey Dent is. And we've met his wife before in the comics prior to this, but we never really had much of her aside from just being this secondary character. Like, we really see the impact his descent to madness had for her, which was incredible and heartbreaking. But we're not here to talk about that because we got to wrap this up with the last Gaiman statement. Yep.
Yes, I'll just say one thing. Pat Broderick's art. Sometimes it's good, sometimes it's appropriate. I think on Captain Atom it was great, but in the context of this annual, I don't think it fits. What do you think?
I quite disagree. I actually quite like it.
Okay.
I think really when we look at the sequencing, there's not a lot of creative use of paneling. I'll say that. Like, we have your traditional boxes and rectangles, but it flows well sequentially. I can tell what's happening from scene to scene. I feel like the gnarled visage of Harvey Dent is excellent in here. I actually quite liked it. My only hesitancy is that it's so similar to the epilogue and prologue artwork. it kind of is at odds with the very distinctive artwork that we had for the other two origin stories of the Penguin and Riddler, respectively. It feels like it's trying to match what happens in the prologue and the epilogue compared to what we had before, where each one had a very unique visual style to it.
Well, I think the issue is that he, of all these artists, is the most traditional. And so his art is, well, for lack of a better term, it's slightly more generic than the French artist or the other, who was the other one?
Oh, Sam Keith.
Sam Keith, yeah. So, and not to say it's bad, because Pat Broderick's art on its own is unique enough to stand out. Like when he was on Captain Atom, when he was on, I believe he was on Batman at one point, his artwork does stand out, but it's just that compared to the other two, he's more traditional. That's all I'll say.
Oh, I don't disagree with that. I still think there's some great sequences here, though. I think there's a lot of attention to detail, especially on Harvey Dent's face on page 9 of his story, where you just see all the pocks and all the pits of his face. There's great detail there. I love the body language he's able to do in some of these instances as well. Again, it's not as distinct as some of the other art, which is what makes it weaker in comparison. But I still felt it matched the tone of the story. Although, really, there's no, I guess, clear line between this artwork and what comes next, because it is very similar in that vein, where we get to the epilogue, where the crew is wrapping up their story.
Right. Are you going to talk about this?
Would you like me to?
Yeah, sure, I can. So now we get, it's kind of a fun little montage where they're interviewing people on the street. And is this, okay, because this is inked by Kevin Nolan, so I find this art really good. But we get like a cross-section of different people, and the last one, like we see like kind of like a 20-year-old kind of hippie, we see an older black woman, we see an old white guy, we see a teenager, we see an old white woman. Then it ends with a shot of a guy who's clearly John Constantine, right? So, sorry, I'm not going to do the accent, but sorry, Squire, I'm not from around here. Make that no comment. So
that was a perfect Yorkshire accent. That was
great.
Exactly.
they're trying to, they're just interviewing people on the street, but I just love the way that they incorporated these characters into it. So as they're getting more information from people in Gotham about what their opinions are of all these villains, just on the last page, we see the figure of someone walking in behind the guy who's doing the interviews. In a purple trench coat, and what kind of hat is that? I don't know what you call it.
Like a big fedora, or maybe even a Panama hat.
Right. And he's walking away, and then just as that figure disappears into the background, the guy who's the host of the show starts giggling. He. And then we see that he's clearly been infected with, whether you want to call it Smilex or Joker venom, but he's got the Joker smile. And in the background, we now realize that the figure who walked by him was the Joker. And so that also resolves the subplot of the whole, story where they're trying to interview the Joker as well. So it was a nice little ribbon they tied onto the story, right? So
absolutely. And I think it ties into the beginning where Batman said, well, you better be careful. It's a pity that you're not scared. And this is like him getting his comeuppance. It's like, this is why you should have been scared, because you're dealing with psychopaths and criminals.
It's great. Yeah, it's a great little ending. I love it.
It's a great issue. I did mention I had read this many years before, mainly because I heard about that Penguin story and I was intrigued, but I was just floored by this entire issue. It is, honestly, even though it's a diverse range of writers and artists, it still feels cohesive on some level. Tonally, it's there. There's a very mature feeling to this, and you get the idea where there's a lot of self-awareness too, especially with that Riddler story, where there is that commentary on how dark and how bloody comics are getting. And there's just a brilliance running throughout this, and it's no wonder, given this sort of talent, again, say what you will about the man's character, that's separate, but in terms of his talent, especially at this point, wow, it's no wonder they decided to take that gamble with Neil Gaiman and said, you can write this? Okay, we'll take that chance for that weird Sandman series that you want. We'll go for it. If you can do it with our established characters, let's see what you can do with your own.
I am with you 100%. Like, again, this was during the time when Alan Moore was on his way out from DC, and at this point, he was Neil Gaiman was probably the closest thing they had to Alan Moore, right? And so, as you can see here on his work on like their mainstream characters, he did an incredible job. So he didn't do as much mainstream work as Alan Moore did. They both have collections where you can get all of these stories in one, and we're going to try and cover pretty much all of them. So, but yeah, this is great. It's great to see him take on Batman, because I think this is the only first of 2 times he wrote Batman characters. The second one would have been Whatever Happened to the Caped Crusader. Remember that?
Oh yeah, I have those issues somewhere in my house.
Yeah,
and
me too.
I'm going to say this too, echoing what a lot of my friends say. It's not that they so much like the character Batman, but they like the universe he inhabits, and that includes his rogues gallery. And
Sure.
You can either just go with the same tropes that you always have, or you can tell interesting stories. And this is a set of interesting stories about all of these characters. Yes, there's some action, there's some drama, some pathos, but in the end, nothing feels like an established tropey comic book superhero story. Everything feels unique. This is one of those great tonal shifts that happened in the late 80s, where people said comic books were getting mature, not in the image, blood, and guns way, but in the sense of emotional and cognitive maturity, where there is intellect happening here and reflection. And honestly, I think this stands up with all the other high watermark material that was coming out from DC, especially in the late 80s.
I agree. I don't know what else to say. Yeah, I love Neil Gaiman's writing. This was during the peak of Batmania, and it kind of gets lost in the shuffle, but this is worth digging up if you can find it, and it has been reprinted. So we both highly recommend this, right?
Oh, yes, absolutely.
And there's going to be more Neil Gaiman coming up, but before we get to that, next week's episode, we're going to be talking about, for the first time, we're going to be covering Garth Ennis.
Ooh.
And we're going to be reading a story called Troubled Souls. Not sure if you've heard of this one, Adam.
I don't think so.
I've never read it, but it's by Garth Ennis and John McCree. So I think it's going to be an interesting one, to say the least. Who knows? Maybe it won't be good, but I'm sure it'll be fine. It'll be worth reading. So
I'm sure it will be a larf, and hopefully we'll have a nice man with us to comment on this. With that said, of course, tune in for the next episode. It's going to be fun, and you can hear us recite these because we have a backlog of these episodes that people can check out, right?
That's right. This is I think we're on number 6 now. What is this? I think today's episode's number 8. So you got 7 more you got to check out if you like this one. There you go.
Mm-hmm. And you get to see more of my cats, like this.
That's right. Woo! Aw. There you go. So cute. Okay. All right. We'll see everybody next time then. Bye.